enjoy being read to. It's just a listening time, that's all.
Well, thanks for having me, Mrs. Lung's class. Very excited to be here. I know she told me you're not that excited about this George Washington book, but my degree, when I went to college, I studied government. I liked these kinds of things. So this is interesting for me. So thanks for being my listeners. I'm really happy to be here. And maybe next time I'll get to read something more exciting. So thanks for listening. So we're on chapter 3. Caden knows we are. Military leader. All right, so as commander of the Continental Army, General George Washington reviewed the battle plans with his trusted officers. George had to gather an army of untrained civilians, teach them to fight, and lead them in a difficult war against the British. I couldn't think of Mulan for a minute. Military leader. By 1774, America was again having major difficulties. George left Mount Vernon and traveled to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to join the Continental Congress, a group of colonial leaders who wanted to make sure that the colonists' rights were protected. The Continental Congress decided that Britain did not have the right to tax them or to tell them how to run their own government. In addition, the group decided to boycott the trade of all goods with Britain. The British were not happy with America's new attitude toward them. They were ready to do whatever was necessary to make sure the colonies remained firmly under the control of and continued to pay taxes to the British government. By the time the Continental Congress met for the second time in 1775, a long time ago, American and British soldiers had started fighting. In June of 1775, the Continental Congress chose George to head the Continental Army of the Revolutionary War and gave him the title of general. When George was appointed commander-in-chief of the army, there were no soldiers. It was up to George to recruit the colonists for service, build an army, and lead the fight. Although George was a famous and brave soldier, he was not very happy about going back into war again. He told Martha, whom he called Patsy, that he would much rather have stayed with her and the family at Mount Vernon. He wrote, "You may believe me, my dear Patsy, when I assure you in the most solemn manner that so far from seeking this appointment, I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it." George also knew, however, that he could not say no. Or if he did, it would seem as if he did not believe in America's independence. On July 2nd, 1775, George arrived at the Continental Army's camp near Boston, Massachusetts to take command. He worked hard to train the soldiers and struggled to make sure that they had food and supplies. Each winter, Martha went to the Continental Army's camp to be with George and then left in the spring when the men went off for the battles. Although winter camp was relatively safe, there was still a war going on. About her first winter visit between 1775 and 1776, Martha wrote in a letter to a friend, "Some days we have a number of cannon and shells from Boston and Bunker's Hill, but it does not seem to surprise anyone but me. I confess I shudder every time I hear the sound of a gun." Ooh, me too. On March 4th, 1776, George and the newly formed Continental Army finally won their first victory. During the night, the army brought cannons up to the top of a hill in Dorchester Heights near Boston. From there, the army could fire into the city and into the unsuspecting British camp. When General William Howe, who was in charge of the British forces, woke up the next morning, he saw the colonists what they had done. Since it was too dangerous for the British to stay within the range of the cannon, they boarded ships and left Boston. The colonists had been fighting with the British for a year, yet they were not really sure exactly what they were fighting for. Some colonists believed that they were fighting to be treated fairly by the British government. Others thought that they were fighting to form their own country, independent from British rule. As the fighting continued, more and more of the colonists began to believe in the fight for independence. Finally, as the Continental Army was anxiously awaiting battle on Long Island, in the New York colony, the announcement came. Congress had voted for independence. It was now officially a war for freedom. Within a few months, Thomas Jefferson, one of the members of Congress, began to write the Declaration of Independence. Once Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, who were also members of the Congress, offered their input, the document was sent for all members of Congress to review. After some initial revisions had been made, it was adopted by Congress on July 4th, 1776, just as more British ships began arriving in the Northeast. When George heard the news, he sent out orders to have the document read out loud to every unit in the Continental Army. Within 2 weeks, more than 39,000 British soldiers arrived on 427 supply ships and 52 man-of-war ships. The superior British forces soon took over New York and New Jersey. In August, the British captured New York City, and when they headed toward the Continental Army, George ordered his army to retreat to Pennsylvania. Each time the British struck with their greater numbers and better training, they killed, wounded, or captured many of the American soldiers. Toward the end of 1776, the Continental Army had only 3,000 soldiers left, compared to the 15,000 men George had the year before. To make matters worse, most of the soldiers would be free to leave soon, since their enlistment period would expire on January 1st, 1777. George thought the British would soon win the war. However, he had to try his best to fight because he believed that America should be free from the British. Late on Christmas night, he gathered most of his men in boats and led them across the Delaware River from Pennsylvania to New Jersey. The soldiers marched all night through the wind and sleet until they surprised the British forces at Trenton, New Jersey. After winning the battle at Trenton, George moved quickly to attack the British regiments in Princeton and won that battle too. These victories gave the Americans a chance at winning the Revolutionary War. Soon, more and more American colonists joined the Continental Army, since it seemed now there was a real chance of winning their freedom. The growing American forces won a significant victory at Saratoga, New York, in the fall of 1777, when they captured almost 6,000 British soldiers. The Army stopped fighting for the bitter winter of 77 through 78 as the Americans camped near Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. For the first 2 months of the winter, the soldiers suffered awfully. There was not enough food, clothing, or other essential supplies. About 1/4 of George's men died from the cold weather, hunger, or disease. The horrible conditions upset George terribly. He wrote what he observed: men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes by which their marches might be traced, by the blood from their feet. By the spring of 1778, George learned that France had agreed to support the Americans in their war with Britain. The Continental Army now had a partner that had many soldiers and ships, which would make the war between America and Britain more closely matched. The British retreated to New York City, and the Continental Army camped on the outskirts of the city. For the next 3 years, most of the fighting took place in the South, where both the Americans and the British won and lost battles. Then, in 1781, Lord Cornwallis, the leader of the British Army in the South, invaded Virginia and took over Yorktown. 5,000 French soldiers, whose leader was General Jean Rochambeau, had met up with and joined George and his men. While George and Rochambeau were talking about attacking New York City, they received a message that the French Navy was on its way to help, but could not travel as far as New York. George and Rochambeau gave up on the idea of attacking New York right away. Instead, they decided to attack Yorktown with the combined forces of the Continental and French armies from the land and the French Navy from the sea. It was about 450 miles from the camp of the Continental and French armies to Yorktown. George knew that if the army had any hope of getting there without the British in New York City knowing, they had to have a good plan. George intentionally let some British spies see what looked like secret documents that said the French Navy was sailing to New Jersey. Then he had some men begin the preparations to build a new camp in New Jersey, one that would be big enough for many men. In the meantime, the Continental and French army marched part of the way toward Yorktown, and then took boats down the Delaware River the rest of the way. George rode his horse ahead of the men to make sure that the French Navy actually arrived. On September 5th, 1781, the Continental and French armies began to close in on the British in Yorktown. While at sea, the French Navy fought the British fleet. Try as they might, the British ships were not able to get past the line of French ships to help Lord Cornwallis. On October 17th, the Continental and French armies opened fire with all the weapons they had and all their force of will. Lord Cornwallis and his troops could not hold out any longer and called for a truce. On October 19th, they surrendered. Although this was the last major battle of the War for Independence, the Continental Army stayed out in the field for another 2 miserable years. During this time, the men waited for the peace treaty to be signed by both Britain and America. George's men got more and more restless as time passed, eager to get paid and go home to their families. George called a meeting to talk to his men and to try to persuade them that they should be patient for just a little while longer. The men, however, were not moved by his speech. In a final effort to convince them, George remembered the letter in his pocket from a certain congressman and decided to read it out loud. When he opened the letter, he stared at it blankly. After a moment, he pulled out a pair of eyeglasses, something his men had never seen him wear before. He said to them, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in the service of my country, and now find myself going blind." In that moment, many of the soldiers were so moved they broke down and cried. George's speech had been a success. 3 days later, on March 18, 1783, George received word that the treaty had been agreed to by both parties. In September, the British and the Americans signed the treaty, and once the British left New York City, George resigned his position as commander. On Christmas Eve, 1783, he rode his horse home to Mount Vernon, where he planned to spend the rest of his life as a retired gentleman working on his farm. Okay. Thanks for listening.
Great reading.
You're welcome.
Great audience. Thank you for being so polite.